On 21st April 2025, Pope Francis died at the age of 88. An avalanche of tributes poured down the smallest state in the world, the Vatican City. South Africans also beat their drums in acclamation and approbation of a man who walked into the conclave with broken shoes, preferring to ride in public transport and paying his own bills. It is now the apposite time to look back. Let me start by quoting a press release which was issued by Abahlali Basemjondolo. This is an organization of more than 150,000 shack dwellers. It stated, and I quote, St. Francis never accepted the fact that there was inequality in the world. He was against the atrocities in Palestine and in Sudan. Although there's still a long way to go, he moved the church closer to justice for LGBTQI+ people. He understood that everyone is equal, that it is the forces of oppression that deny this, and that society must reflect the equality of all human beings. Pope Francis touched issues that must have been difficult for him to raise, such as the West being responsible for the taking of minerals in Africa and leaving Africa in dire poverty. He visited leaders like Fidel Castro and the great footballer Diego Maradona. He also encouraged the working together of all religions and tried to build peace and respect across religious divisions. I close quote. Now, what happens when a pope dies? Let me quote from a work entitled The Final Conclave by Malachi Martin. I open his mouth. The conclave must begin at the latest 20 days from on which the previous pope dies. During the days of official mourning, all Vatican flags are flown at half-mast. The 5 bells of St. Peter's take up a traditional morning cadence, tolling for hours on end each day and into the night. The Vatican attendants prepare the body for burial, washing and embalming it. When the days of official mourning are over, Requiem Mass is sung in St. Peter's, attended by all cardinals in Rome, by the diplomatic corps, by government representatives, and by tens of thousands of Roman Catholics. I close his mouth. We know that on Saturday, the 26th April 2025, the world came to a standstill to watch the interment of Pope Francis. He is the 3rd head of the Roman Catholic Church to depart from this side of paradise in the 21st century. He was following on Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI. Pope Benedict resigned in 2012 and passed away in 2022. Brief historical steps back in time to the second half of the 20th century and the departure of popes always manifested the interesting dramatic and theatrical spectacle of the election of the Bishop of Rome by the College of Cardinals. The electoral process is often preceded by behind-the-scenes intrigues of lobbying, persuasion, factions, cabals, blocs, and changes of fortune, which transpire before the next pope is elected and occupies the sede vacante, the vacant see. The factions can be broadly divided and categorized as traditionalists, conservatives, progressivists, and radicals. A cardinal once described the tense atmosphere in the conclave which elected Pope John Paul II thus, I quote him, "We ate supper together, but there was a very little discussion. In the cool breeze of the courtyard of St. Damascus, we took our evening stroll in silence. There was a strange tension among us. To this day, I have no explanation for the choice of Karol Wojtyla the following day." I end the quote. A few interesting facts about the Roman Curia, the administrative body of the Church, the process and procedure of election, the papal regalia, idiosyncratic challenges of the incumbent's pontificate, and some ecclesiastical attributes might worth a cursory attention. I would also like to indulge in looking at the fortunes of the last 6 popes from the latter half of the 20th century to date. And these are Cardinal Angelo Gesip Brancoli, who became Pope John Paul the 23rd, Cardinal Giovanni Battista Montini, who became Pope Paul VI, Cardinal Albino Luciani, who became John Paul I, Cardinal Karol Wojtyla, who became Pope John Paul II, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who became Pope Benedict XVI, and Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio, that is Pope Francis. It is a long-standing and invariable tradition that after a papabile, that is, a member of the Vatican College who is eligible to be elected Pope, accepts his election, the Cardinal Dean of the College announces Habemus Papam, which means we have a Pope. The new Pope chooses a name by which he will be known as the Pontifex Maximus, that is the Supreme Pope. In the past, incumbents often chose a name from the past popes. Pope John Paul I was the first to choose a double-barreled name, which was derived from 2 of his immediate predecessors, that is Pope John the 23rd and Pope Paul VI. His pontificate lasted only for 33 days. One of the most renowned Vaticanologists, David Yallop, suggested that the Pope's foremost act was to request investigations into the financial affairs of the Vatican Bank, which is officially called the Institute for the Works of Religion. After receiving an interim report, and I quote, "Within hours, Albino Luciani was dead, and the lies and cover-up surrounding the death of the 33-day Pope had begun," close quote. Yallop controversially postulated that Pope John Paul I was poisoned because he was looking into the affairs of untouchable cardinals like Cardinal Meshinkos. Well, the jury's out as to whether the Pope died of natural causes or he was poisoned. Now, let us look at further issues that have regard to the papacy. It is alleged that Cardinal Meshinkos was involved in financial malpractice that is worth billions of dollars. Anyway, let us pass that point. Now, Ratzinger reverted to the old tradition of a singular name, and then came Francis, who was the first to take a name which none of his predecessors took. Hence, we've got a name that is without a numerical, simply Pope Francis. He was the first Jesuit to be elected Pope. A fascinating fact is that Pope Francis took a name from Francis of Assisi, a worthy saint, but who came from the most powerful and absolutely corrupt popes of the 15th century. And one of those was Pope Alexander VI. Alexander was the spawn of a notorious family called the Borgia family. This history is brilliantly chronicled in a work called The Borgias. Now, the rule is that popes beyond the age of 80 are not eligible to vote. After the death of the Pope, the Camerlengo takes over administration of the Holy See until a new Pope is elected. After the burial, the Camerlengo convenes the Conclave, where the voting cardinals go into seclusion in order to vote. The papal election takes place in the Sistine Chapel, where the walls are adorned with murals painted by the great artist of the 16th century, Michelangelo. It is moving to walk into the Sistine Chapel. I've got there 2 times. The election requires a 2/3 majority for a successful candidate. Canon Law 332 states, and I quote, "After his acceptance, the person elected immediately becomes the Bishop of the Church of Rome, true Pope and head of the College of Bishops. He thus acquires authority and can exercise full and supreme power over the universal church," I close the code of canon law. Cardinal Wojtyla's theatre background came into place when he accepted his election with a script handwritten in Latin. Before the election takes place, a few white papal regalia are tailored. I quote, "For the new Pope who will be elected at the Conclave, the Vatican tailors prepare 3 sets of investments: large, medium and small sets of white cassocks, white slippers embroidered with a gold cross, white skull cap, red rochas, red cloaks, and red stoles. Then after election, the Pope-elect dresses up and appears to greet the crowd congregated in St. Peter's Square. These elections can be protracted over a number of days before the threshold is reached. The longest election transpired in the Conclave, which elected Pope Gregory X. It lasted from November 1268 until September 1271. But I quote, "He was not consecrated as the Bishop of Rome until March 27, 1272. The popes have come from a variety of social class backgrounds. However, they were all highly educated. John the 23rd was born in 1881 in a family of peasant farmers. Paul VI was born in 1897 and graduated at the University of Milan. John Paul I's first father was a laborer in a factory. He was born in 1912 and he was the first pope to be born in the 20th century and the second generation in his family to get formal education. He graduated at the Gregorian University in Rome and taught moral theology, canon law, and sacred art. And all the other pope, of course, engaged in teaching. John Paul II was born in 1920. His father was a non-commissioned officer in the Austro-Hungarian army, and his mother was a teacher. She died of heart and kidney-related problems 9 years after Carol was born. He was brought up by his father, who also died of a heart attack 12 years later. He studied at the Angelicum University in Rome and took his doctoral degrees summa cum laude, with the highest distinction in all the subjects. His thesis was on the idea of faith in the thought of St. John of the Cross. He subsequently became a university professor of moral theology. He was the first non-Italian pope in 450 years and was fluent in Polish, Italian, French, German, English, and Portuguese. Cardinal Wojcinski made the following remark about him. The decision of the Conclave has crossed the barrier of 4 centuries of tradition in the Church, the barrier of language and the barrier of nationality. It seemed it would be difficult for the cardinals and the Roman people to accept the decision. But to the contrary, the election of a pope has been natural and simple, and the acceptance by the Roman people has been warm and spontaneous. I close the quote. After his election, he was portrayed as a cardinal, I quote again, who possessed nothing. He had only 3 threadbare cassocks, 4 red ones, his skis, and the pedals for the canoe. Everything he received, he gave away. He ate little, he did not smoke, he drank very little wine, I close quote. He was vociferous on social justice. He was criticized by the Curia on that theme. Pope John Paul II's retort was, "I have made and still make my opinion for the poor. I identify with them. I feel the weight of responsibility to leave nothing untouched in serving the cause of justice and solidarity among the citizens of a country and among nations for a better tomorrow. Close quote. Pope John Paul's successor was Benedict XVI. He was born in 1927 in Bavaria, Germany. His father was a police officer. Ratzinger dedicated himself to studying, and in 1958 he became full professor at the age of 31 and taught at various German universities. All popes wrote tomes of books and encyclicals, but Ratzinger was one of the most prolific. Only two cardinals, Ratzinger and Echegaray, were brought into the insular, powerful, conservative and rigid career by John Paul II. Popes typically do not abdicate or retire, but they occupy the see till death. On February 11, 2013, Pope Benedict XVI stunned the resident cardinals in a convocation by announcing, I quote, "I have convoked you in this consistory after having repeatedly examined my own conscience before God. I've come to the certainty that my strength, due to advanced age, are no longer suited to the adequate exercise of a Petrine ministry. I have to recognize my incapacity to adequately fulfill the ministry entrusted to me. I declare that I renounce the ministry of Bishop of Rome, successor of St. Peter, entrusted to me by the cardinals on April 2005, in such a way that as from 28 February 2013, after 20 hours, the See of Rome, the See of St. Peter, will be vacant, and the conclave to elect the new Supreme Pontiff will have to be convoked by those whose competence it is." I close quote. After his resignation, he was accorded the title of Pope Emeritus. The last of 5 popes who resigned was Celestine V, who resigned in 1415. Now let's come to Francis. He was born in 1936 in Buenos Aires, Argentina, of Italian immigrants. His father was a railway worker, and he joined the priesthood against his mother's fierce opposition. He studied humanities in Chile, philosophy and theology in Argentina, taught at a seminary in Argentina. He was appointed vice-chancellor and completed a doctorate in Freiburg, Germany, on the subject, Reflections of Apostolic Life. While it is true that he was the first pope elected from outside Europe, his line of ancestry was Italian and was the first generation born in South America. His parents escaped from the fascism of Mussolini. Obviously, the 6 popes came from different family, social, religious, and political contexts. The challenges that they contended with were just as widely diverse as the geopolitics of their epochs evolved and posed new challenges. Thus, they stamped individual personalities, even though there were recurring features of world politics which affect them in more or less the same way, within and outside the church. The world being so complex, one can only simplify it by selecting major historical markers which affected the world at large. I would like to take the risk of oversimplifying and err on the enthusiastic side rather than the conservative side of historical discourse. Events that had an impact on the church and institutional religion in the world in the 20th century were the Cold War, which arose out of World War I, the Russian Revolution, the atomic bomb, World War II, the rise of communism and its nation states in Asia and Europe, and fascism. And then, of course, the Cold War, I mention again because it's important, the new configuration of the Balkan states, the Great Depression, students' uprisings in Europe, the rise of liberation movements, liberation theology in South America, schisms in the church, and configuration of the world after the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the rise of new liberation movements. Except for Francis, all the popes experienced the horrors of World War II at close orbit in one way or another. It had an impact on their individual worldviews. John the 23rd ascended to the papacy in the late 1950s until the early 1960s. He was active in saving some Jews from the Holocaust. His major act of transformation in the Vatican was convening the Second Vatican Council, which subsequently brought about many modernizing changes in the Church, including the liturgy from Latin. The First Vatican Council was convened by Pope Pius IX in 1869. John the 23rd preached social egalitarianism and practiced ecumenism. He intervened in Italian political landscape by bringing together, for example, two politically opposed parties to cooperate. But he did not live to see the conclusion of the Vatican Council. The task was left to be taken forward by Pope Paul VI to complete. The irony of Montini's election to the papacy was that Pope John the 23rd banished him from the Vatican. The reason was that Montini wrote a report which implicated the Pope's nephew in financial corrupt activities. The nephew was a cardinal. Now, Pope Paul VI completed the Vatican Council, the Second Vatican Council. Now, one of the major changes which it brought about was the abolition of the Tridentine Mass, that is the traditional Latin Mass, and it opened the language of the liturgy to vernaculars of the world. The unintended consequence of this change was the polarization of groups within the Vatican. I can say that they can be divided into two, traditionalists and conservatives on the one hand, and progressivists and radicals on the other. One of the most recalcitrant traditionalists was the Swiss Archbishop, Marcel Lefebvre. He vehemently opposed the liberalization of the Church instituted by the Vatican Council, and he was suspended by Pope Paul VI. Lefebvre was recalcitrant and provocative, despite all attempts at reconciliation. Now, Pope John Paul tried reconciliation and had several one-on-one meetings with him. Eventually, he reluctantly excommunicated him by virtue of canon law in 1988. John Paul's multilingualism made him one of the most competent communicators, and he took the papacy to the world as the most widely traveled pope. The Roman Curia was critical of his frequent privileges across the globe. His response, as expressed on his visit to the African continent, was that, I quote, "Some people in Europe think that the Pope should not travel, that he should stay in Rome, as was always done. And this strengthens my conviction that the time has come for the Bishop of Rome, that is the Pope, not to think of himself exclusively as the successor of Peter, but also as heir of St. Paul. As well know, who never stood still, was always traveling. And what is true for him is also true of those who work with him in Rome." Close quote. We know that the Turkish national shot him right in St. Peter's Square on 13 May 1981. After the attempted assassination, Cardinal Albert de Courtrai of France warned him from visiting France. But he was adamant and determined, and he said, perhaps tongue-in-cheek, I quote, "I assure you, Your Eminence, there is no place more dangerous than St. Peter's Square." Close quote. He grew up under the draconian regime of the Polish government, and at times he went dangerously head-on with the regime during his priesthood. He was therefore averse to communism, and I quote, "Wojtyla fought battles against the communist regime, but then as the Bishop of Krakow, he did not use clamorous denunciations or explicit political interventions. In fact, he made important contributions to the political cultural organization called Janak. And he also collaborated with Odrogenie a clandestine group directly dependent on Cardinal Wojcinski. Communist authorities consistently refused to grant him permission for the construction of the new church. At close quote. Perhaps this is what led to what was regarded as his misunderstanding of the communism of South America, which was a resistance to ruling by juntas. Pope John Paul II opened the dialogue with Eastern Orthodox Church and opened doors to Islam and Judaism. His generosity was so extensive that he canonized a record-breaking 483 saints, and I quote, more than the combined tally of his predecessors during the preceding 5 centuries. At close quote. He initiated what was known as the Great Jubilee 2000, which called upon Catholics to be active in evangelization. He was the longest-serving pope, up to 27 years in 2005, at the age of 84. His beatification and canonization were the fastest in the history of the Catholic Church. Now, Benedict XVI was a close ally of his predecessor, and their positions coincided on a number of doctrinal themes. Among them were questions of abortion or birth control or artificial contraception, clerical celibacy, and ordination of women. On abortion, they took the orthodox line and objected to the United Nations Cairo Conference of 1994 and his position on sterilization and abortion. The rise and exposure of sexual abuse of children by the Catholic clergy and the rights of LGBTQI plus rights rose to attention gradually during their papacy. By the time of Francis' election, it had long reached its climax, and criticism against the papacy was that not enough was done to address it. Now, Pope Francis was unique in several ways. He was the first pope who was born and bred in South America, as we mentioned. He was vociferously critical of powerful and corrupt figures in the government of Argentina. He lived a frugal life to the point of austerity and connected with the underprivileged and poor in Buenos Aires. This lifestyle was manifest immediately after his election. He refused to wear the papal paraphernalia and the traditional red shoes, preferring to wear his worn-out shoes. On the question of sexual orientation, he was empathetic and desisted from condemnation of gay and lesbian rights. He stood firm in the face of harsh criticism by conservatives and traditionalists in the church. I quote, "In the past, the Pope has admonished some American Catholics as excessively conservative, backward, and reactionary to progress, especially in the context of gay rights and women being ordained." Close quote. One writer described him as follows: as an amiable model breaker, and he elaborated. Days before going to hospital in Rome in February 2025, Pope Francis sent a very strong rebuke to American bishops for their tepid response to the mass deportation orders of the Trump administration. It unequivocally condemned the actions of the US government. It was eloquently grounded in Catholic social teachings and scripture, clearly calling out members of the US hierarchy whose response had tended to ignore the urgency of this appalling and destructive policy. This letter to the American bishops showed Francis' understandings of the multi-pronged crisis facing Catholicism in the United States. It was also an excellent example of his acute political antennae and his willingness not to shy away from confrontation in the name of the Church, its teachings, and the responsibility of standing up for the most marginalized. At close quote. A journalist and political science succinctly describes him thus in comparison with his immediate predecessors. I quote, elected in 2013, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, the first Latin American pope in history, brought to the Vatican a concern for social justice rooted in the radical liberation theology of his home religion, along with an unprecedented focus on environmental issues and migrants' rights. This was a dramatic shift in priorities after the conservative pontificates of John Paul II and Benedict XVI, both of whom were more concerned with upholding traditional morality than with reviving basic Christian values of equality and fraternity. I close quote. When he was Bishop of Buenos Aires, on the Palm Sunday of 2000, he proclaimed, I quote, today the place for Christ is the street. The place for Christians is the street. The Lord wants us like him, with an open heart, roaming the streets of Buenos Aires and carrying his message. At close quote. He was a breath of fresh air and fresh spirit in the Vatican, true to the name of the city that he served as bishop. Its full original name was Santa Maria del Buen Aire, Our Lady of the Good Air, of the Good Wind. Cardinal Stephen Breslin, the Bishop of the Archdiocese of Johannesburg, said, and I quote, while he was lauded by many as a reformer who pushed the church in a more progressive direction for addressing issues such as climate change, LGBTQ+, inclusion and economic equality, some conservative voices within the church accused the Pope of straying from traditional Catholic doctrine. Francis was probably the Pope who received the most abuse in the modern era, sadly, very often from within the Catholic Church, rather than without, at close quote. I would like to suggest that the phrase within the Church refers to the powerful Roman Curia and some resident cardinals of the Vatican who are active in the administration of the Church. In certain circles, there is the feeling and impression and predictions that the Catholic Church is likely to move to the right after the election of Francis' successor. Now that hangs in the balance. Now that the curtain has gone down on the stage of a Pope who sought to shake the foundations of conservatives and traditionalists, the conclave will go into seclusion for election of the successor on the Petrine chair. Now the next act begins, and as Yallop observed, I quote, when the Pope dies, we make another one. So rubs a popular saying in Rome. I close the quote. While this statement may be said in humor, it has grave connotations. The collective pronoun, we, may be a reference to the Roman Curia. The ominous word here is make, which is a superordinate of choose, shape, direct, mold, instruct, control, and manage. Now, whoever is elected by the conclave must work closely with the Curia, and they will certainly watch him for 24 hours a day and scrutinize every word that he utters or writes. Now, it remains to be seen whether the conclave will go outside the Romance languages speakers for a third time, after Wojtyla and Ratzinger, Polish and German, respectively. But what matters most, more than the language or nationalities, is the direction that the next occupant of the Holy See will take among these three groups: traditionalists, conservatists, progressivists. How he will square up to the Curia if he moves too fast in reforming the Church will be an act which will require the resilience of Pope Francis and the mettle of St. Paul and St. Peter molded into one persona. We need prayers. So help us, God.